I'm Dr. TediAnne Hasapopoulos, a faculty member of Bethel Seminary. As we explore the cultural and contextual opportunities within our ministry work, we have multiple facets of relationships to examine. One relationship is our inner self, as we explore our personal biases and practices as they impact our response to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another relationship is interpersonal, as we competently respond to others appropriately in light of cultural similarities and differences. A third relationship is mediated by organizational systems, as these systems help or hinder our appropriate leadership response to diversity, equity, and inclusion circumstances. So how might we examine the organization in a systemic and systematic manner that allows leaders to assess the ways in which current systems impact diversity and inclusion outcomes? The Center for Global Inclusion has developed an assessment tool that allows leaders to do just that: assess current organizational systems through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. This presentation provides an overview of that assessment called the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, GDEIB for short. We will also consider applications for this tool in ministry settings. The GDEIB was developed by Nine Moliere, Julia O'Mara, and Alan Richter, and 112 expert panelists who have been deeply involved in advancing DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes, in multiple organizations across the globe. The Center has made this resource freely available to leaders seeking to examine their organizations. The following slides have been provided by the Center for Global Inclusion, and I'm happy to be able to use them as I present this to you. The Center offers the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarks, standards for organizations around the world, the tool's formal title, also known as GDEBI for short. The reason is to support organizations globally in the development and implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) best practices. The GDEIB helps organizations realize the breadth, depth, and integrated scope of DEI practices. It assesses the current state of DEI, helps determine strategy, and measures progress in managing diversity and fostering equity and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion has emerged as a worldwide practice that is critical to an organization's success. As with other disciplines, such as quality and safety, standards are needed to establish criteria by which to measure and monitor progress. Here is another way to say what the GDEIB is and does. The panel of experts that developed the GDEIB have determined best practice benchmarks that, if implemented in an organization, will lead to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes in that organization. The GDEIB is a tool that explores how an organization compares to these best practice benchmarks. The goal for publishing these benchmarks is to encourage high-quality work in the DEI field, regardless of the type of organization or where it is located. Sometimes people in organizations think that diversity, equity, and inclusion refer only to how well people get along and/or how much people know about customs and cultures and holidays. But high-quality diversity, equity, and inclusion can deliver organizational results that spark the development of innovative products and services and give the organization a competitive advantage, that strengthen collaboration, which results in smoother operations, that literally saves lives in some healthcare instances where differences in beliefs can have negative consequences, that inspire peace building in communities, and that foster environments where people are retained and able to work at their full capacity. The development of the GDEIB began in the early 1990s. The momentum for advancing this tool to its current state began when the expert panel was identified and expanded between 2006 and 2016. This panel of 95 individuals collaborated to create benchmarks. Substantive work in 2016 included the addition of a category on sustainability, significant improvements in benchmarks, and added ultimate goals, worked on the language that crosses sectors, an explanation of systems impact, review for possible Western-centric emphasis, and clarification of the benchmark levels. It updated its accessibility to people with disabilities, numerous other factors, and an update of appearance and graphics. And released in 2021, a major revision also advanced benchmarks on equity practices, as well as created changes in the tool itself to use online technology for administration. In addition, in the 2021 version gives consideration to current issues such as remote work, the need for psychological safety, promotion of wellness and self-care, and responsible and ethical sourcing. The GDEIB uses English language style as recommended by the United Nations. This English language style has clear and translatable language. It avoids culturally specific words and phrases, such as idioms or local expressions, and it uses the United Nations spelling. So let's get into the structure of the GDEIB overall model so that we are able to see the comprehensive nature of the tool. The GDEIB works to explore systems in 4 major areas of any organization. There are the foundation systems, which drive strategy. There are the internal operating systems, which attract and retain people. There are the external interface systems, which listen to and serve society. And there are the 4th set of systems, the bridging systems, which align and connect the other 3 sets of systems. Foundation benchmarks are those used initially and throughout to build and sustain the DEI initiative. Internal benchmarks focus on systems and processes that strengthen how the organization operates and how the effectiveness of people is increased. Bridging benchmarks are critical linkages that bridge foundational work with the internal and external focus of DEI in the organization. External benchmarks relate to how the organization offers its products and services and interacts with its customers and other stakeholders. Let me give you an example of what we mean by DEI working as a comprehensive system. Example 1 of operating as a system. For recruitment, which is internal, to be successful, the organization must have excellent relationships with the community, which is external, and communication efforts, which is bridging, both inside and outside the organization to be strong. Another example of operating as a system, customer service, external, will be enhanced with excellent DEI education and training, which is internal, that is reinforced when leaders are held accountable, which is foundation, for the relevance and the effectiveness of the training. For most organizations, work will need to be done in all categories simultaneously, as activities must reinforce each other. The groups and categories are not sequential. You don't start with 1 and then go on to 2 and 3 and so forth. The benchmarks in various categories interact to support and reinforce each other. There are 4 important definitions to know to fully understand global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmarks. Diversity, inclusion, equity, and global. All 4 of these definitions were agreed to by the panel of experts. You'll find literally thousands of definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the internet. However, these definitions that have been agreed to by the panelists, so it's a pretty solid definition worth using. Diversity is a wide variety of differences and similarities, referred to as dimensions among people. Listed here are some key dimensions. We are sensitive that what the various diversity dimensions are named vary by geography, sector, or organization. And in some parts of the world, homosexuality is illegal and or considered immoral. Nonetheless, it is a dimension of diversity. The term inclusion has been described by practitioners and scholars in several different ways. In the global DEIB benchmarks, the important quality of inclusion is that it helps create a fair, equitable, healthy, and high-performing organization or community. And in that organization or community, people are valued. These are the end goals. The above slide is the exact wording of the definition as it appears in the GDEIB. One additional definition that needs to be added to the discussion is the definition of intersectionality. This is complex ways individuals hold marginal group affiliations at the same time. And these identities can combine, overlap, or intersect in a person or in a group. It results in multiple interdependent systems of discrimination and oppression. And the definition of equity? It's about fairness and justice. It's about taking deliberate actions to remove systemic, group, or individual barriers and obstacles that hinder opportunities and disrupt well-being. Equity is achieved through the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that create and reinforce unfair outcomes. We want to take a moment to talk about the difference between equity and equality. Both promote fairness. Equality achieves fairness through treating everyone the same, regardless of need or circumstance. Equity, on the other hand, achieves fairness through treating people differently dependent on need, circumstance, and consideration of historical and systemic inequities. One more definition is the definition of global. What do we mean by global and the scope of global? These benchmarks apply to all organizations around the world. It simply means that the benchmarks are usable in all organizations. These benchmarks are not just for organizations that have customers or locations around the world. They apply to organizations no matter where they are located. Now, at times, this definition might seem a little confusing. This is because some organizations don't think that they are global because the scope of their work is geographically confined. But because of the interaction of people groups and different cultures within all of our communities in the modern times, that means that our interaction at all times is in fact global. So in what ways can we look at our organization, even if it is operating in a geographically prescribed area, and allow ourselves to see the ways in which it is globally interacting with other people? When considering the ultimate goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, people tend to emphasize one of two perspectives: helping to make the world a better place for all, or helping to improve organizational performance. The priority of one perspective over another may be influenced by circumstance or context. Some people emphasize that not only are these perspectives complementary, but when DEI work is done well, both goals are achieved. The next several slides are descriptions of each perspective and the related role of the GDEIB. The GDEIB has approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion that include all of those depicted in this graphic. Notice how the many parts overlap and they are integrated as important elements of a whole. One element is building competence. This approach focuses on increasing the competence of individuals to interact more effectively, particularly in culturally diverse settings. The next is being in compliance. All organizations need to be in compliance with rules, codes, legislation, and regulatory requirements. The GDEIB assists in that. Honoring dignity. This approach focuses on the secular, religious, and spiritual recognition of the value and interdependence of every human being and our interdependence. The GDEIB assists in looking at this important element. Developing the organization. This approach focuses on systematically improving organizational performance. It does so by allowing the benchmarks to signal to an organization both across many factors of the organization, but also deeply within each factors, ways in which the organization can advance in its organizational performance. Advocating for social justice. This approach focuses on achieving fairness, equity, and doing so locally and globally. With these approaches in mind, let's now talk about a benchmark. Synonyms for the word benchmark, as we would use it in the GDEIB, include a standard, a milestone, yardstick or a criterion for success. Usually, an organization sets annual goals designed to move steadily toward reaching higher benchmarks. It may take several years and many activities to achieve the highest level of benchmarks. Once a benchmark is reached, the organization must be committed to maintaining that standard in the years to come, or it may even set higher standards. Benchmarks at the highest levels are called best practices. In GDEIB, those are at level 5. Because organizations are different types and sizes and in different sectors and sometimes different locations, the specific benchmarks will vary for each organization. Therefore, the global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmarks may need to be adjusted for your specific organization. We should mention competencies in this discussion. They are not the same as benchmarks. Competencies are important markers to assure that quality work is done. Competencies are skills, knowledge, and the ability that people need to achieve the benchmarks. So what might be the uses of benchmarks in your organization? Well, well-defined benchmarks, as specified by the GDEIB, are vital to sustaining organizational planning and execution. Here are a general list of those uses. Benchmarks are used to set and stretch standards and agreed on to your desired state, to assess the current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization, to engage employees, to determine short-term and long-term goals, to measure progress, to assist in hiring D&I staff and consultants, and as a gift to organizations in your community. This slide depicts the 5 levels of progress, or the 5 levels of benchmarks that can be used when employing the GDEIB. At the very top are best practices. These are demonstrating current global best practices, and this is what it means to be exemplary. The next level is progressive, implementing DEI systematically and showing improved results and outcomes beyond what is required or expected. Then there is to be proactive, kind of a middle range. It's an awareness of the value of DEI. It's starting to implement DEI systematically. And this is what would be required and expected of all organizations. There is the reactive level of progress. This is a compliance-only mindset. Actions that are taken primarily to comply with relevant laws, social pressures. It is doing the bare minimum. And then the lowest level of progress would be to be inactive, where there's no DEI work having been begun. The diversity, equity, and inclusion are not part of the organization's goals. You can see that across the number of different systems in an organization might be at a best practice level in some of the systems in an organization, would hopefully be at the proactive level, level number 3, which is in moving forward, or there might be places where it's simply in the reactive mode, where the organization is complying. Sometimes it's a matter of resources that set where an organization is, and sometimes it's a matter of awareness. The GDEIB assists with that awareness. Let me take a moment to highlight a little bit of information about the research and the expert panelists that brought forth the GDEIB. The expert panelists were carefully selected by the authors based on their collective experience, many being well-known practitioners, authors, and researchers in the field. Most of the expert panelists are doing comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion work in aspects of their environment around the world. A few were added because of their special expertise in compensation, measurement, or supplier diversity, for example. The research is based on the collective opinions of these expert panelists. The research process involves several rounds of review, discussion, editing, and research consensus. The authors take final responsibility for the decisions that have been made. The diversity in background and experience of the expert panelists greatly enhances the collective viewpoint. Some are practitioners, some are scholars, some are both. They represent a significant array of diversity dimensions as listed earlier in the definition of diversity. In closing, I want to summarize the actions brought to the forefront by GDEIB engagement. I'm returning to those 4 major systems that operate in every organization, including ministry organizations. First are the GDEIB indicated actions for the foundation system as it drives strategy. Develop a strong rationale for DEI, vision and strategy, and align it to organizational goals. GDEIB actions hold leaders accountable for implementing the organization's DEI vision, setting goals, achieving results, and being role models. It calls for providing dedicated support and structure with authority and budget to effectively implement DEI. Imagine what it might look like in a ministry context. If the desire is to engage multiple people in gospel work, the organization must have a DEI strategy to do so and sound systems that drive that strategy. What might DEIB indicated actions be that attract and retain people? Well, these are internal systems. And GDEIB actions would assist with talent development, advancement, and retention, would help achieve work-life integration and flexibility, would help ensure that job design and classification are unbiased and compensation is equitable, would assist in educating leaders and employees so that they have high level of DEI competence. The third are bridging systems that align and connect all the other systems as the GDEIB identified actions. These would ensure that assessment, measurement, and research guide DEI decisions. It would help make communication a crucial force in achieving the organization's DEI goals. It would educate all towards DEI competence, and it would connect DEI and sustainability initiatives to increase the effectiveness of both. And the fourth category of systems are the externally facing systems that allow us to listen and serve society. GDEIB identified actions for that system is to advocate for DEI progress within local communities and society at large. Embed DEI in product and service development to serve diverse customers and clients. Integrate DEI into marketing and customer service. And to promote and nurture a diverse supplier base and encourage suppliers to advocate for DEI. In a ministry context, while these are not surface level evident with their connection to ministry, I want to challenge you to give some thought to the ways in which ministry's outward focus can parallel each of these points. And so, with all this said, I want to share with you again the depiction of the GDEIB model as it looks at internal aspects, foundational aspects, external aspects, and the ways in which bridging happens to bring all these together. The GDEIB is designed to assess each one of these areas and then also assess deeply within each. I'd like to close with just one quotation from a user of the GDEIB. The GDEIB provides a systemic and structural approach to DEI, paving the way for a truly transformative journey. Self-reflection as a leader is critical to continuous growth and learning. And as you navigate the categories and benchmarks, you have to ask yourself, am I walking the talk? Am I living this as a leader right now? For more information, the Center for Global Inclusion's website. Please keep in mind that this is an excellent tool for all organizations, large or small, involved in ministry work or involved in commercial work or involved in nonprofit work. It's an excellent tool. Thank you for listening.